we undergo digital transformation and embrace algorithms, AI, and machine learning at many more touch points in the name of reducing friction, we should also be careful to understand when friction is actually beneficial. So hi everybody, I'm Renee. I'm on the faculty at MIT, but I also am lead researcher at MIT's initiative on the digital economy's Human AI Interaction Research Group. And I'm happy to share with you some work today, but I want to start off by going back in time to 1979. Maybe some of you weren't even alive then. In 1979, these were the most famous people in the United States. And in 1979, this was one of the covers of Time magazine. See, synergy with the last talk. And in 1979, this was on the news, a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It's interesting how things sort of connect to the present day. But for this talk, what I really want to focus on is what was shared at an IBM corporate meeting in 1979. And this is a piece of that. It said, a computer can never be held accountable. Therefore, a computer must never make a management decision. So that's how it started, to use the sort of meme structure. And here is how it's going. We have AI being used to interview and hire people for important jobs. We have in Germany, physicians being allowed to prescribe digital apps that use AI. And you may soon have an AI teammate that knows when it's time to take over for you. So we have quite a different sort of reality than what that 1979 IBM slide talked about. And when it comes to customer experience and AI, we see that the investment in AI is tremendous. We're on pace to invest $110 billion by 2024, according to McKinsey. And what we see here is a focus on, as I've underlined, using AI to reduce customer effort and friction. Frictionless being a sort of goal that AI can help us achieve. And so going with the meme, this is when you would hear the record scratch and you'd say, well, you're probably wondering how we ended up in this situation. So when we think about behavioral science or behavioral economics, I'm sure you're familiar with this book. And turns out that the average person in the West makes about 35,000 choices per day. That's a lot of cognitive load. And in order to manage this cognitive load, we have this sort of bifurcation in our brains of system one, system two, thinking fast with system one and thinking slow with system two. And that's an important background because we want to be rooted in the science, but it also has an effect on customer experience and satisfaction with different brands and different services. So for instance, with regard to healthcare, 70% of Americans feel that the system is difficult to navigate. Right? Cognitive overload, lots of friction. In taxes, right? Everyone is supposed to do their taxes, but most Americans favor simplicity in their taxes and would prefer simplification and less friction. And even the rise of the CES score, the customer effort score, to really get at how easy or difficult was it for you to get the help that you wanted today? How much effort did you have to use? How much friction was there? So to get rid of this friction, given our cognitive load, people have taken on the strategy that is rooted in behavioral science using nudges. So we use nudges to reduce what Cass Sunstein calls sludge and eliminate friction along customer journeys and in customer experience. And this has led to what I like to call frictionless fever, where there just is this embrace of frictionless. So some examples. Now AI allows you to just walk out of stores and your hand or your face being your identification or your wallet. Aldi, Hudson, and Amazon Go allowing you to skip the checkout. We have an embrace of frictionless where you see the race to build the future of autonomous investing. The future of investing is frictionless. Or if you really are customer first, you should be putting in the time and money to eliminate friction points with your internal and external customers. The frictionless enterprise, the rise of frictionless shopping. Is your store ready? Frictionless, the top biggest customer experience buzzword of 2018, a frictionless future for finance, delivering frictionless commerce. A new imperative for healthcare, a frictionless experience. And the fast and the frictionless, which I think might be a movie starring Vin Diesel, I'm not sure. But you see this embrace of frictionless and this sort of frictionless fever. And when we think about AI being used as a means of achieving frictionless customer experiences, it sort of raises the question, what is the implication? And so here's a pop quiz. What percentage of AI is biased? Feel free to come to the chat or think about the answer yourself. That's right, Lauren and Lisa, 100%. Correct, Dina, 100%. That's right. Because AI is trained on past data, 100% of AI is indeed biased. So this is a problem if we frictionlessly apply AI, particularly because AI is often assumed to be neutral, and it is absolutely not. So for instance, in healthcare settings or in facial recognition usage, we see that there may be a bias due to sampling that results in higher degrees of error depending upon the color of your skin or what culture you come from and what kinds of facial expressions are common there. Or you can look at this. This is a company that helps other companies, a B2B company, understand better its big data and to identify the gender of its customers and its data sets. So you put in the name in this platform. So let's put in Megan Smith, and Genderify will tell you whether Megan is a man or a woman. And you see that it says 60% probability that she is a woman. But when you put doctor in front of Megan Smith's name, you now see that the algorithm now says that it's a 76% probability that Dr. Megan Smith is a man. So consider some other examples. An algorithm that was used by Stanford to determine when vaccines were first introduced, COVID vaccines, who got the vaccines first, actually ended up prioritizing people who were not frontline healthcare workers, which led to a big protest around the algorithm's errors. Another example from the UK, due to COVID, students not being able to sit their university entrance exams, and an algorithm then being used to predict what their scores would have been had they been able to sit the exam. This unfortunately led to students from lower socioeconomic statuses being shuffled into lower status universities and shut out from other opportunities at higher status universities. Now, what's interesting though, is the way this is talked about. The algorithm clearly didn't work, or how an algorithm caused the grading crisis. In other words, the algorithm made me do it. And so I think a lot about this. I think a lot about who trusts algorithms, what that means, when, and if the algorithm makes a mistake, where the blame is placed. So I want to share with you a brief sort of one study. I've got lots of studies to share, but in the interest of time, one study that I think sort of gets into this issue of algorithms and what kinds of implications they have for the experience. So here we have a fictional character named Jerry, and this is being used in the experiments that my colleagues and I have run. And imagine that Jerry is responsible for evaluating Bernard. Now, Jerry is evaluating Bernard, and in our experiments, we have a variety of evaluative scenarios. Healthcare, where Bernard is a patient, Jerry is a physician. College admissions, where Bernard is an applicant, Jerry is an admissions officer. Criminal justice, where Bernard is a defendant, and Jerry is a judge. And we randomly assigned people to each one of these conditions and asked my colleagues, Ziv Epstein and Dave Rand and I asked, well, what would happen if AI contributed to a negative experience? Where would people place the accountability? In these experiments, then, we randomly assigned people to conditions where Jerry made the decision on his own, or when Jerry made the decision with the input of an algorithm or the input of another human being. And the outcome was one where Bernard was declined, but later found out to actually have been qualified. So Bernard was rejected in the admissions case, but later went on to be an award-winning student at another university. Or in the criminal justice setting, Bernard was later found to actually be innocent, despite Jerry's intuition, System 1 judgment, that he was guilty. So given this sort of mistake, where would the accountability be placed? What we found was that incorporating algorithms into the decision lowered the perception of Jerry's responsibility. And it lowered it to a level that was commensurate with if Jerry had made the decision with other people involved. When we think about then this impact of biased AI and how the presence or involvement of AI in untoward experiences affects where people place accountability, then we realize that AI should not be frictionless in its application with our consumers, with our users, with our employees, with our partners. I prefer to think about friction instead of thinking that friction is tantamount to a pain point and something to be eliminated. I like to think of it the way that physics thinks about friction. In physics, friction is neither good nor bad. It just is. In fact, you need friction in order to accelerate, as you see that this runner is doing here. The force versus the friction allows you to move forward, to change direction without slipping out of control. That's good friction. Of course, too much friction could lead to negative outcomes, where this runner, for instance, would get a blister. But this notion that friction in and of itself is bad is a very sort of, is lacking in nuance. And so this is why I want us to think about good friction, particularly as we think about the use of AI in customer experiences. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to share 4 principles to eliminate bad friction and to add good friction that we can think about moving forward. First, we should ask, should AI be doing this? Here's an example of a recent Clubhouse chat room discussion that was entitled, Should AI Make Life or Death Decisions? I'm here to tell you, if there's one thing you take away from this talk, the answer is no, AI should not be making life or death decisions. So in our processes, we should be adding friction to take a beat to ask, should AI be doing this? Or even, can AI do this? Can AI predict who's going to commit a crime? No. Can AI tell what I'm feeling just by facial recognition? No. And so adding friction to understand whether and when AI should be applied is an important first step. Number 2, this conversation about customer obsession, I think really could lead us down a bad road of surveillance and this sort of never-ending hunger for extracting as much data and value from our customers as possible. Customer obsession can become creepy. So let's turn customer obsession into citizen advocacy in order to build trust in our brands. It's not just about collecting as much data as possible or being as ingrained in our customers' lives as possible. It's also about advocating for customers. And that is how our brands can build trust. For example, advocacy by eliminating dark patterns and embracing transparency. Just because other companies or brands are doing it doesn't mean we should. Now, when it comes to dark patterns, what does that mean? Well, One example of a dark pattern, or a way in which we nudge people in directions that limit their autonomy and make it easy for us to manipulate them, is a metaphor I like to think of: a lobster trap. So I'm in New England, lots of seafood and lobsters, so I'm going to use a New England example. Now, if you know anything about lobster traps, you put the bait in the trap, the lobster goes in, and it's really easy for the lobster to get in, and there's lots of incentive for it to enter. But the lobster can't get out, it's trapped. And we see this being used with AI as a tool, this lobster trap version of dark patterns. An example, for instance, Keith previously talked about Facebook or Meta. When Facebook acquired WhatsApp, it said very clearly, we are not going to sort of cross the streams. Your information and your data on WhatsApp are going to be left private, and we're not going to use this for Facebook to sell you stuff. A few years down the line, however, WhatsApp updated its terms and privacy policy after everyone has created their networks and shared their information. And if you don't agree to the new terms, turns out over time, you won't be able to access your chat list, you won't be able to read and respond to messages, and you'll have limited functionality. This is asymmetric friction. Low friction to get in, high friction to get out. A lobster trap enabled by technology and AI. So citizen advocacy is about eliminating those dark patterns and embracing transparency, especially when we're using AI, and eliminating the lobster trap. Another example of this, a high-tech motorcycle vest that uses AI. Where's the lobster trap? Well, the motorcycle vest, which uses AI to anticipate that you're moving at a velocity and therefore inflate to protect you, will stop working if you miss a payment. That's a lobster trap. Or another example, imagine that you're using a photo app and here's this pop-up trying to upsell you. You decide that you don't want to be upsold, but how do you get out of this screen? Very difficult to do. Well, this is the lobster trap. Very difficult to find the way to exit. Friction to exit the trap, but lack of friction to enter. Using technology then to use dark patterns to trap customers. Principle number 3, audit customer journeys to identify touch points that could benefit from friction being removed, but also touch points that could benefit from added friction. Friction auditing, if you will. A good example of friction that you might want to add is the model card. If in your business you're using AI and you're using algorithms, model cards, which were developed first at Google by their ethics team, led by Margaret Mitchell and Timnit Gebru and others, is essentially like the side of your cereal box, where you see the calories, how much riboflavin and iron. Well, with a model card, this makes transparent and unearths what the assumptions of the algorithm are, when it is applied and when it shouldn't be applied, when it works and when it's prone to error, and what population it was trained on, where bias could be introduced. This is an example of good friction that will allow us to improve our relationships with our customers, improve trust, and to minimize harm from AI. And number 4, we talk a lot about eliminating friction in the goal of being customer-centric, but we're dealing with people, and they're not just customers, they're humans. So being human first often involves friction. So in the previous talk, Keith talked about sort of co-creating and people creating values. A really good example of this is from Apple. Here we have on the left a user that needs help with their malware on their MacBook Pro. On the right, we have a fellow user, a customer who does not work for Apple, solving the problem for the first user. This is done on Mac forums, which are provided by Apple, but where customers essentially do work for the brand, unpaid work. But in this way, creating these communities that decenter the brand actually allow them to increase their attachment to the brand, their connection to the brand, and their community with the brand. because the brand actually gives them an opportunity to create their own experiences. This is human first, and this does in fact involve friction, but this is the way that you create a culture that is above and beyond just the utilitarian function of the product. So I want to leave you with a quote from Steve Jobs, one of the most famous brand builders ever. It's not faith in technology, it's faith in people. Reducing friction or pain points is a good idea to the extent that the reduction in friction creates value for the customer and minimizes harm. But as we undergo digital transformation and embrace algorithms, AI, and machine learning at many more touch points in the name of reducing friction, we should also be careful to understand when friction is actually beneficial. And instead of having a binary friction out or friction in view, we should have a more nuanced understanding of when friction actually can be a good thing for our customers and for the brand. So I think I am out of time. Thank you so much for having me here and for your attention. If you want to stay in touch, there's my Twitter handle right here. I'm going to stop my share though, and I will hand it back over to you, Matt.
Great. Thank you so much, Renee. It's a wonderful blended way of thinking about, right, the current issues going on with AI and these positives and negatives. I think, one of the things I brought up as a quick question, wondering if you've ever seen anything like this, right, is, there's the AI is 100% biased because most all of its efforts are trained on this past data, which has its own innate biases. Of course, it's programmed by a human who has innate biases. But I think it can also be used to your sort of like where the friction, AI can also then reveal biases, right? The unconscious biases that we have as humans. Do you have any example of that where you've seen AI or seeing the possibilities of AI to be used to sort of bring up those kind of issues that we have?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think AI, if we use it as one tool in our toolkit, and as a means of doing not a replacement work for the human, right? But to do some of the work that allows humans to then tap into the greater, deeper insights, the creativity, the things that no algorithm can replicate, because this is still the best one, right? That I think is the ideal, right? So for instance, advertising agencies have started to use, GPT-3 and machine learning and algorithms to explore the entire space of, for instance, copy that could be written for a product. So you could plug in attributes of the product, and you could use an algorithm to start to generate some ideas, not in lieu of humans, right? But in addition to sort of human insight, and to make somewhat more efficient and de-bias in some ways the exploration of opportunity, right? Because so Matt, you and I are copywriters, for example, we each bring to bear our own experiences, our own limitations. And it might be a good idea to not just throw some other people in the mix with different experiences, but also to throw an algorithm into the mix that could go someplace that we never thought of going. So I think that's a really wonderful thing. One of my favorite examples of the application of algorithms to sort of minimize bias and to improve kind of human creativity is an algorithm that is used for Legos. So, I have a small son. I have lots of Legos in my house. They're not fun to step on, by the way. But there are algorithms where you could take a bin of Legos, right? So after you've made whatever the Legos were intended to create, you've got all these Legos left over, right? So you've already made whatever the vehicle is or whatever. You've got a bin of Legos. An algorithm can use recognition technology to populate a universe of potential sculptures you can make with the bin you have. That's awesome. So that's de-biasing in a way, in that it's saying, gosh, I never considered that. Look at this algorithm uncovering a stone that I hadn't considered. But I think it's important for us to say, hey, that's okay to consider for like copywriting or Legos, but it shouldn't be used to determine life or death, who should be hired or not, and who is going to commit a crime. It's just, we're not there for Minority Report, right? And it should never be used for that. And yet it is. And yet it is.
Yes, right. And for sentencing reasons, again, a lot of the discussion around AI, the biases of AI are because it's been revealed through its attempts to do these things to show that. And then again, that's where it's like, well, so the language is AI is biased. I think sometimes myself, I want the language to be, no, AI is helping us recognize our own. And so then hopefully we can act on it and realize where our bias is there. This has been great. We could go on. I mean, I could go on for a long time talking about AI and all this on the life and death thing. I mean, you know, in that sense, an algorithm already is determining that because there are self-driving cars on the road. But I look at that as, you know, mechanics are running an elevator up and down. The mechanics fail. I mean, we rely on machines in our life, in life and death situations. They don't always, they're not 100%. In fact, the engineering design is they fail 1 out of 10,000 times is the rough. It may have changed recently, but the principle of engineering and safety for most things, not all, higher danger, higher risk scenarios, it would get higher, but it was sort of 1 in 10,000 times it fails. And so we've essentially built structures and built mechanics, the recognition they are going to be imperfect. And
that's right. And I
the
think
cost, the economics, all these other things, we make trade-offs as humans on some of these things.
We do make trade-offs. And I think a point of differentiation for brands going forward is going to be people feeling comfortable with the way their data are being used, the way these models are being applied, and the firms that have the discipline to resist the siren song of extracting as much data as possible under the guise of frictionless are going to be best positioned to build trust and loyalty in the long term.
Great. Thank you, Renee. Let's give a virtual round of applause to Renee. Thank you.
Very welcome. Thanks, everybody.